Welcome to This Morning on Asakhe podcast, your daily dose of insightful conversation on current affairs, politics, and social issues.
A very good morning
Please
to you
share
and welcome
and
to
also
This
follow
Morning
us on
on
social
Asakhe.
media
My name is
at Site
Kuvimba,
ZW.
and of course I'm here with
Now,
Brighton.
stay
Good
tuned
morning
to
to you guys.
today's
Welcome to the
episode.
show. Welcome to the Friday edition of This Morning on Asakhe.
Today we're going to be talking about the 1.6 billion paid by the Mutapa fund to Kuvimba, which is a mining conglomerate, and I understand this money was paid to shareholders. And today we have an award-winning journalist, Nick Donovan from the Sentry, who did an investigation and wrote an investigative piece on that story. Good morning, Nick, and welcome to the show.
Good morning, both of you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, maybe give us a background, Nick, this morning in terms of investigations. What were your findings in terms of what the 1.6 billion was paid by the Mutapa fund into the Kuvimba company?
So the short answer is that Mutapa Investment Fund is meant to be a sovereign wealth fund, and it seems like one of the first decisions it made is to issue debt in the form of a treasury bill. So it would be debt that all Zimbabwean citizens will eventually pay, in order to pay a small number of private shareholders in Kuvimba Mining House, which owns, for example, Frida Rebecca Gold Mine, Bindura Nickel, Great Dyke Investments, which is a platinum project near Darwindale, and many other gold mines. And the questions that we are raising is whether a well-known Zimbabwean oligarch, Kudakwashe Tagore, is one of the recipients of that money. And we're also raising questions about how Kuvimba and Mutapa, the investment fund, did the valuation to assess whether the 1.6 billion was the right amount, or whether it was a sort of grossly inflated price to someone who may be a presidential advisor and is a sort of crony businessman well known in Zimbabwe.
Thank you so much, Nick. We only get to hear of such when there is a scandal. Maybe share with us some of the red flags that led to this investigation.
So the story starts in Zimbabwe and then moves to Mauritius and then back to Zimbabwe. So Mr. Tagore, who made his money in importing fuel via his firm Secunda, moved into commodity trading and set up a company called Sotic in Mauritius. And the plan for Sotic was to both trade in commodities, so fuel, petrol, diesel, and grain and fertilizer, for example, and also own gold, platinum, lithium mines in Zimbabwe, export the mines, the minerals offshore, keep the profits offshore for doing commodity trading. So that was the plan, and it was never a normal Mauritian company. So it was always denied that Tagore was involved, but we had a lot of leaked documents that showed he was making decisions on everything about where to buy a printer to whether to spend 23 million on a mine. He was the boss. And Sotic had the interest of very senior politicians from the get-go in Sotic. For example, there was a proposal to prepay to the state oil pipeline company, NOIC, 1.2 billion US, in order for fuel to flow through the pipeline at a discount. And Sotic wrote up the proposal, but when it was sent to NOIC, it was actually sent to NOIC by SB Moyo, the former general and then foreign minister after the 2017 military-assisted transition, or coup, depending on your point of view. And the contract from Sotic to the oil pipeline company had already been signed by the Reserve Bank governor, John Manguja. So this is a sort of very unusual thing for a foreign company to have this kind of stamp of approval from senior officials. And when the NOIC, the pipeline company board, received the proposal, they, in the minutes, they just said, look, clearly the government has decided to already go ahead and do this. It's a done deal. We've got to accept it. So that's the kind of patronage that firm had. And during that period, Tagore's firm, Sotic, bought all of these mines, Frida Rebecca, Bindura Nickel, Great Dyke Investments, and so on. And then Tagore was sanctioned in 2020, and they moved all of the mines to Zimbabwe. So from Zimbabwean ownership to Mauritius ownership, then back to Zimbabwean ownership into a company called Kuvimba. And we had started to investigate this around that time in 2021. And everyone denied that Mr. Tagore was involved in Kuvimba at the time. And we had lots of leaked documents to show that he was still involved. And there was a company that owned Kuvimba called Ziwa. And in turn, the owners of Ziwa was a company called Fimbi Resources. And in turn, the owner of Fimbi Resources was two trusts, one called the Eagles Trust and one called the Kuda Kwashere Tagore Trust. So we managed to show conclusively that Mr. Tagore owned part of Kuvimba. And at the time, the acknowledgement was that the state, through different forms, like the National Venture Fund and the Sovereign Wealth Funds, and some compensation was going to go to pensioners who had lost out on currency reforms. All of these different state entities had been allocated 65% of Kuvimba, and there were private investors or managers in which we proved that Mr. Tagore was involved, who owned 35%. So that was the beginning of our investigation. Those are the sort of red flags that we found back in 2021, that Kuvimba wasn't a normal mining house. It was a partnership between the public sector and the private sector. And in the private sector, part of it, there was a well-known crony businessman, Mr. Tagore.
Well, thanks so much, Nick, for that response. Quite interesting what you are raising there. There was an article coming from Newswalk when they interviewed Tagore and asked him about if he was a shareholder in Kuvimba, and he denied being a shareholder. He says, "I'm not part of Kuvimba and I've never been part of it." You can ask Mutapa Investment Fund CEO John Mangushka about these issues. Maybe speak to us more about that in terms of ownership and also shareholder. When was Tagore part of this Kuvimba? And also, I see many mines are part of this Kuvimba, Freda mine and so on. Maybe give us a timeline, if you know any dates when Tagore was part of this Kuvimba before he was sold, before the Mutapa Fund sold to Kuvimba.
So at the present time, the company records for Kuvimba and one of those other companies that I mentioned, Ziwa, which was the parent company of Kuvimba, those are missing from the company registry. So, in fact, no one can be certain at this point in time, and last year when the Mutapa bought the shares, no one can be sure who the owners were, but we can be certain in 2021. So the timeline was that in 2019, many of these individual mines, Great Dyke Investments, Frida Rebecca, Bindura Nickel, they were bought by Sotic. 2020, they were transferred to Kuvimba. So from the Sotic, which was a Mauritius company, to Kuvimba, a Zimbabwean company. And in 2021, we published our investigation, and we had used leaked corporate documents and company records to show that Ziwa was one of the shareholders of Kuvimba. And this was acknowledged by Kuvimba at the time, in that they put out a big advert. And that in turn, Ziwa was owned by a company called Fimbi Resources, or part owned by a company called Fimbi Resources. And Fimbi Resources directors were Kuda Kwashere Tagore and his wife, and the owners of Fimbi were two trusts. So that was the point in time in 2021. And Mr. Tagore has consistently denied being involved in Kuvimba, and he kind of has to, because he's sanctioned, and it would make that company really difficult to do business externally. But when other companies, for example, platinum companies, have tried to enter into joint ventures with Kuvimba, there was an example in 2022 when Implats tried to do a deal with Great Dyke Investments, which is part of Kuvimba, and they couldn't do it because they couldn't get to the bottom of the corporate structure of Kuvimba, and they called it off. So that was reported at the time. So people were having trouble trying to confirm and bottom out the ownership of Kuvimba in 2022. That's the more recent part of the timeline. And then we spoke to businessmen and business people who dealt with Kuvimba in as late as September 2023, so just before Mutapa bought the shares. and they said that Mr. Tagore was taking key decisions at Kuvimba in September 2023. So they were, confirming not an ownership of the firm, but saying that he was taking a sort of managerial role and taking the big decisions. And that indicates that he was still involved until very recently, until just before the share purchase. So there's a timeline that he's been involved in Kuvimba consistently, and we can prove that he was involved in an ownership way in 2021. And it remains a question about which corporate entity, which company, which PVT received the Treasury bill, received this money from Mutapa. And that's one of the questions that we think that the Zimbabwean Public Accounts Committee and the Auditor General should investigate, because it's all public money. All of this money that's paid by Mutapa comes from debt, and that will eventually be paid by Zimbabwean citizens, and Zimbabwean citizens have a right to know how their public money is being spent.
Maybe as a follow-up to that, what I asked about Kuvimba and Mutapa Investment Fund now that the 1.6 billion has been paid from Mutapa to Kuvimba, what does it mean in terms of ownership of Kuvimba and the relationship between Mutapa Investment Fund?
I think the position we are in now is what Mutapa and Kuvimba are claiming, so we don't dispute that at all, is that Mutapa, if you recall, I was saying that private investors, in which we said in 2021 at least, that Mr. Tagore was one of the owners, private investors owned 35%, and different government of Zimbabwe entities, so the state, own 65% of Kuvimba. And I think the position right now is that Mutapa bought all of Kuvimba. They bought the 35% shares which were held by those private investors. And so at the present time, it's 100% state ownership of Kuvimba. And the question that we're raising is who got paid? So who received the money from Mutapa for those 35% of Kuvimba shares, and what valuation method was used to calculate 1.6 billion? Because the previous valuations had been less than a third, or there was a tripling of valuations from 2022 to 2024, which I can go into. So we're saying who got paid and how did they calculate how much should they get paid, because it's all Zimbabwean citizens' money issued as debt.
When the government of Zimbabwe acquired Kuvimba, did they disclose these facts to say this is how we have acquired and we used to buy it, and all the important information that should have been disclosed to Zimbabwe citizens?
So there was an announcement in the form of an interview saying that they had bought the 35%, and then I believe there were other announcements, but the price wasn't disclosed. And there's a really good article by the New Talks on the 22nd of April 2024, so this year, and they broke the story that the price paid was 1.6 billion. And and so that wasn't disclosed. That was broke by Zimbabwean journalists. So that 1.6 billion, let me put that in context for a bit. It's huge in Zimbabwean terms. It's 5% of GDP. So GDP is a way of assessing the size of an economy. And it's more than the health and education budgets in Zimbabwe combined. So in 2022, the health and education budgets combined was 1.2 billion. And it's sort of macroeconomically significant. It's the kind of money that really could make a difference to, for example, if you were trying to electrify every home in Zimbabwe. A lot of people are without, half the country is without electricity in their home. That 1.6 billion could go a real long way to electrifying the whole country, expanding the electrical grid, for example. So this 1.6 billion, it's a really significant amount. And this is why we're raising the question about who received it and why was it such a high amount?
People have been asking, is it RTGS, is it Zimbabwean dollar, is it ZiG, is it US dollar? Please clarify that for us.
So the report from the New Talks said it was US 1.6 billion. However, the format in which it was paid was in the form of a Treasury bill. Now, there are no details about how this works, but the other thing that's been going on at the time is that Zimbabwe, as you know, defaulted on its public debt, so its debt that it owed to foreign creditors, and it can't raise and borrow money from the international market except at really high rates. So it borrows from Afreximbank at 10% and 9%, for example. So Zimbabwe is a poor country. It really needs to invest money. It really needs to borrow to put into rail, electrification, dams, and so on. So it needs to borrow cheaply, but it's locked out of the debt markets because of past defaults and because of past not paying debt. All of these debts have accrued and there have been penalties and arrears. And until recently, debt stood at 18 billion US. And in the last few months, that jumped by 3 billion to 21 billion. And of that 3 billion jump, half of it, if the Newshawk's report of the 1.6 billion is right, half of it, of this jump in debt, went to these private investors in Kuvimba. And the special thing about the Treasury bill, in terms of arguing whether it's ZiG or Zimbabwe dollars and so on, is supposed to be denominated in US dollars according to the Newshawks. But normally, a holder of a Treasury bill might try and sell it to a bank at a discount. So in the jargon, they say we've discounted it. And they might get hard currency, so in the form of cash in their bank account, of a much less. So they might take a 10% cut or a 40 or a 50% cut in the value of the Treasury bill. And what that means is the person who sells the Treasury bill, so whoever these private investors are, they might try and sell it. I don't know whether they have or whether they might try and do it in the future, but they might try and sell it to a Zimbabwean financial institution at a steep discount. They would get the US dollars in their bank account, and the bank, or maybe an institution like the NSSA, might hold it. And then after the Treasury bill, which is normally lasts for a year or 5 years or 3 years or 10 years, after its time is up, it matures and you can go back to the Reserve Bank and you'll be issued the face value of your Treasury bill plus a bit of interest. So that's what might happen to it in the future.
Thanks so much, Nick, for your time this morning.
Thank you, and thank you both, and thank you to all of the...
Yeah, we'll have come to the end of the show for this Friday. For myself, Brighton,
and it's bye for now.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode. For feedback, you can contact us on 263-777-470017. Don't forget to follow and like our social media pages.